And I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning for the Disability Organizing Network's webinar, Making Your Campaign Accessible, Website and Online Tools. On this first slide here, we do have an image, and it is the logo of the DO Network. And inside the green box with an arrow on it, it says DO and Network and then Disability Organizing. So a little bit about the DO Network before we get started. The DO Network is our branding name for Disability Organizing Network. You can check us out on the web at www.disabilityorganizing.net. And we offer technical assistance, resources, trainings, campaign coordination, and team building and power building for independent living centers as well as the disability community at large. We like to say that we organize for accessible communities wherever people with disabilities live, work, learn, shop, play, and of course vote. We are a program of California Foundation for Independent Living Centers. CFILC is a membership organization open to all of the independent living centers in California, and the mission of CFILC is to grow the capacity of independent living centers to serve the disability population in California. So we're going to go ahead and get started today. Here's a list of our presenters. My name is Ted Jackson. I'm the Community Organizing Director at California Foundation for Independent Living Centers. We also have with us the Honorable Tony Coelho, a retired member of the United States House of Representatives, and as we all know, the author of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Good morning, Tony. How are you?
Good morning, Ted. Nice to be on with you.
Great. Also joining us again for another webinar is Michelle Bishop, Disability Advocacy Specialist for Voting Rights at the National Disability Rights Network. And Michelle and I have done a number of trainings and a lot of work together. We, in fact, did a full day-long training at the April conference last year. So I'm really happy to have Michelle on with us this morning. Good morning, Michelle. How are you doing today?
Good morning. I'm good. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Great. And for the first time, we're welcoming TJ Schlosky, Director of Assistive Technology Services at the Illinois Assistive Technology Program. So, TJ, welcome to the team and good morning.
Good morning to you all. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate today.
Great. So I wanted to start us off. I know that we're going to be talking today, about accessibility, especially for campaigns when it comes to websites and online tools. But I wanted to really start us off with a little bit of a refocusing and some facts and figures about why we should be thinking about including voters with disabilities and why they're so important, really just to the basic electoral math of campaigns. So we need to really take a look at some of the increasing voter registration and turnout trends that have been happening in the last decade or so. So back in 2000, voters with disabilities were about 62% of voter 62% voter registration rate, compared to voters without a disability who were about 78%. So we saw a very large gap, a 16-point gap between voters with disabilities and voters without disabilities. But by 2012, that gap starts to shrink. In fact, it shrinks dramatically down to 2.3%, with 69.2% of, I just caught an error on this slide. I just want to correct. It should say voters with a disability were at 69.2%, and voters without a disability are at 71.5%. I apologize. But voters with a disability are just about 2.3% below voters without a disability. So we're seeing a dramatic decrease in that gap in voter registration. That's largely due to a lot of the efforts of groups like Michelle's organization, the PNAs, the Centers for Independent Living around the country, and different organizations that through the NVRA are doing voter registration in their centers and really working through the community to decrease that gap. We also saw a gap change in voter turnout. So in 2000, voters without a disability made up 52% of the electorate. had a 52% turnout rate. Voters with a disability had a 41% turnout rate. So there was a gap of about 11%. But we start to see that gap by 2012 decrease to just under 6%. And that's pretty significant. By 2012, we're seeing voters with disabilities really start to turn out for Election Day. Now, we've got that 6% gap, and we're really concentrating on that 6% gap in the disability community this year. And we want to take a look at what does that 6% gap really look like, and if we increased it, what would it look like in terms of raw numbers. So according to the U.S. Census, there's roughly 36 million eligible voters with disabilities throughout the United States. In 2012, 15.6 million of us turned out to vote in that election. And this year, our goal is to close that 6% gap. And we're estimating that that is going to be, in this election, about 3 million more voters with disabilities that show up at the election. And on this slide, there is an image, and the image is of people with disabilities at a rally in New York City. So how do voters with disabilities compare to other voting blocks? There's an image on this particular slide of a line of voters all holding a piece of paper that says voter, and in the middle of the line, everyone is standing, but in the middle of the line there's a person in a power chair. So if we take a look at some of our demographic groups from the 2012 election of participating voters, white non-Hispanic voters were 98 million people in America. But then, as you can see on the slide here in bold, we're going to really look at minority voting blocks. African Americans were nearly 18 million voters. Americans with disabilities were the second largest minority voting block with 15.6 million voters. Latino Americans were 11.2 million, and Asian Americans nearly 4 million voters. There were about 20 million of what we call crossover voters, so voters who fit within two or more of those categories. But if we take a look at those 3 million voters, if we're able to do that this year, that would bring our total up to 18.6 million people with disabilities voting in America. If trends hold, that would make people with disabilities one of the largest, if not the largest, voting bloc in America. So it's really significant that we start to shape our discussion and our campaigns around the issues that voters with disabilities care about. We're also seeing a lot of excitement and enthusiasm for the 2016 election this particular year. And on this slide, we do have an image. It's red, white, and blue, and it says Presidential Election 2016 with 2 stars on it. So what is energizing folks in 2016? Many of us think that it's the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. That really renewed our energy. It allowed us to look back 25 years ago and celebrate this landmark accomplishment, and then also analyze how far we've come in the last 25 years, and in the process of doing that, realize we're at a different place of power, and that it was time to start really building electoral power and getting active in elections. And indeed, because of that, I think we've heard a lot more about disability in the presidential primary elections. We need to be asking ourselves, who wants to continue programs? There are candidates out there talking about continuing the programs from the previous administration, from the current administration, that have been beneficial to people with disabilities. And what are those programs? Who's saying what about the ADA? Folks who are running for office, some are saying that the ADA is unconstitutional. Others are saying that the ADA is really a cornerstone of independence for people with disabilities and many more people going forward into the future. And who's talking about employment? And I'll tell you what, I singled out this one particular issue on this slide because when you think about independence in the United States of America and being able to provide for yourself, having access to employment is really key to that. And so there are candidates really talking about employment out there, and in fact in the last week, sub-minimum wage was a big topic in the news. And how are people with disabilities being characterized? We've had at least one candidate mock people with disabilities from the podium. We've had other candidates lift up people with disabilities and talk about independence and hope for the future. And really what's at stake for people with disabilities. That's a lot of what's driving our involvement this year. And that I think that you're going to see if you're working on campaigns, that people with disabilities are really going to be in touch on the ground in the campaign season this year, because so much of what we've gained in the last decade or so is really at stake for us, especially around health care. Affordable housing is a huge issue, and once it's affordable, it needs to be accessible. You've got to be able to get into the place and to live in it as well. Social services and child care, lots of things. Education is very important. We still have some segregated education in some places in this country. So the door has really opened for this to be our year, and people with disabilities are taking center stage in this election. And there's a concerted effort of folks around the country, and I think it's important for candidates and campaigns to understand that organizations are coming together to build disability electoral power in 2016. Already we're meeting nationally and we're doing trainings to increase voter registration. This summer we're creating our own National Voter Registration Week in July 2016. You'll be hearing more about that soon. And we're really working to increase voter turnout. I talked about that 6% through voter education and numbers-driven voter contact. The old-fashioned phone banks and connecting folks one-on-one to make sure people get out to vote. And organizing not just for 2016, but beyond. And we have a number of logos here as images on this particular slide. There's one for the DO Network. There's a logo for Rev Up. There's one for the National Council on Independent Living. There's one for AAPD, American Association for People with Disabilities. There's a logo of the National Disability Rights Network, which Michelle works for. And then at the bottom there is the hashtag Vote Disability Conference logo. These are all organizations that have come together. At the DO Network, we've been working with training folks on GOTV, that's Get Out the Vote, across the state of California. We just did 10 trainings. We've also done trainings in Georgia, we've done them in Virginia, and we have some more national trainings coming up. Rev Up is an organization coming out of Texas that's sponsored by the group ADAPT, and they've got campaigns going on in Texas, Montana, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and one will be popping up in a town near you. The National Council on Independent Living is offering leadership and bringing people together along with AAPD, and the Disability Rights Network is really working hard to connect folks on election protection to make sure that rights are protected. And then in June of 2016, coming up in just a couple of months, the DO Network will be hosting the hashtag Vote Disability GOTV Leadership Conference to train people on messaging, on Get Out the Vote skills, but also to give our army of GOTV folks the marching orders to go forward and really increase and fill that 6% gap. So there's a lot going on this year. And with that, I now want to transition and hand it off to Tony Coelho, who's going to give some tips for campaigns on creating a disability policy platform. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Chad. Thank you very much. That was a tremendous overview, and your numbers are really important for all of us to have, so that anytime that we're speaking to anybody, we can identify how involved the disability community is in registering and participating in the vote. I bring that up because, as some of you may know, I was chair of the Gore campaign. I also was chair of the Gephardt campaign before that. And I realized that while most of these presidential campaigns and also campaigns on the state and local level organize communities such as veterans community, labor community, women's community, gay community, and so forth. But they never identify really the disability community. They talk in general terms about disability, their support for disability, or as Ted pointed out, in the case of some candidates, ADA is unconstitutional or making fun of those of us with disabilities. But we are aggressively trying to get the presidential campaigns to identify a community. And I will tell you that the Clinton campaign is doing that, and that's the first time that a presidential campaign has ever done that. So in your outreach, when you're talking to people and organizing and so forth, you need to get candidates on both sides of the aisle to be willing to put us at the table along with everybody else. And so let me get into that a little bit now, because getting us to be recognized is a critical thing. And so in starting something like this, I think you need to first find the policy positions that already have been studied or developed by other people, other campaigns, and so forth. And as a result of that, then you would have a place to work from, developing what you think the policy should be for whoever you're working for or whatever campaign you're working on. Then you need to identify and connect with the people that you trust or the campaign trusts, to have them review whatever you're working on, and then seek different perspectives, and then most importantly, get their feedback. So it's always, for every individual campaign that you're working on, it's important to put out things, but listen and get the feedback so you can identify what is good for your particular effort. And you need to make sure that whatever you come up with, that you're trying to solve people's problems. Often candidates, as I've said, are vague and they give general answers. They don't give detailed answers. And you've seen in this election year, when people are questioned for details, they generally, a lot of them don't have it. And respectability, I don't know how many of you know that's a group that really promotes disability rights. They put out a questionnaire to all the presidential candidates. They're now doing it on governors, and they'll be doing it locally as they move forward. And they put out a bunch of questions and asked for responses. The presidential campaigns, if you go to their site, the presidential campaigns have responded, at least I should say most of them have responded. Clinton, also Sanders, and also Kasich put out responses. Some of them were not as complete as others, but that would give you a good idea of a lot of questions and then the responses of the candidates, which I think is very important for you to do. And then what you need to do is increase the involvement in your campaign and in the policy development, so that you then set up task forces that work on different issues. For example, what are the concerns of the disability community of whichever group you're working on, candidate you're working on? What are the policy issues, and give it to a task force. Say, for example, education, or like Ted was referring to, healthcare, but employment. It's a critical issue for all of us in the disability community. We have our rights with ADA, but we need a job in order to participate in society like everybody else. So there's also questions in regards to technology. What are the things that need to happen, and what does your campaign support or not support in regards to technology development? And I can go on about others, peer support, helping people who've gone through cancer recovery or whatever it is, and what adjustments need to be made in regards to helping their recovery. Or going to civil rights. What are the basic civil rights at the local level, the state level, the federal level? What are the things that your candidate should be doing or not doing in regards to those issues? There are a lot of things in regards to the way law enforcement officers, police and fire and so forth, treat those of us with disabilities. As some of you know, I have epilepsy, and when I have a seizure, a lot of times the authorities mishandle the way we're treated and so forth. So a lot of that comes down to training, depending on, on the local level, what is your candidate believe in regards to training for these emergency people in regards to those of us with disabilities. And then I think the other thing that's important today, and Bernie Sanders has perfected this to a fairly well. Obama started moving on it and was successful, and Bernie Sanders is doing it now, and that is social media. Social media at any level is critical to a campaign now. And it's not only getting young people involved, but younger adults and middle-aged adults are now all into social media. And as all of us grow older, social media is going to be the critical thing that in regards to decision-making and so forth. So make sure that you have some people in your effort who will really understand the demographics of your particular area and then project your commitment to their particular interests and their particular concerns. And that can easily be done. And if you do it aggressively and successfully, as Obama did and as Sanders is doing now, then it becomes easier for you to raise money. And as all of you know, you need to have funds in order to conduct a successful campaign. So those are the points that I would put out to any campaign or any people working on campaign. These are really critical issues for our community. And as Ted has pointed out, we are getting more and more involved as a community. I think it's critically important that we make sure that whoever's elected to whatever office, local, state, federal, they understand that we want to participate. We want to be treated like everybody else, and we want the same opportunities that everybody else has. But unless we talk about it, unless we insist upon it, it's not going to be done. So that's what's critical in my view, Ted.
And we're going to move along now to the accessibility portion, which is the main meat of today's webinar. And I want to thank Tony Coelho for joining us today. Hopefully there will be more opportunities for you to join us, Tony. Great.
Thank you, Ted, very much.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to talk about accessibility, and I'm going to hand things off to Michelle Bishop.
Ted, thank you so much. And Tony, thank you for joining us today as a colleague in the disability rights movement. It's such an honor to have you on the call with us today. So let's talk about accessibility. And you can see as we've been going through the slides, if you've been following along, we've been describing some of the images that are included on the slides, which is actually a part of making a PowerPoint slide accessible. So you'll see an image on the slide that's on the screen right now of a person with a disability using a computer. We're going to talk about accessibility in two parts today. I'm going to chat a little bit about how you can use language to be more accessible and also to speak to an audience of people with disabilities in a way that is respectful of the person and in preferred communication for working with people with disabilities. Things to be thinking about as you're putting together websites and composing materials. And then I'll pass off to my colleague TJ, who's going to talk about more of the nuts and bolts of how do you practically make sure that a document you've created or a website you've created is actually accessible to people with various types of disabilities. So as we jump into that, I wanted to start assuming that not everyone on the call is completely familiar with some of the different barriers might be to online accessibility and how different disabilities may change the way people interact with materials that you have up online. So we're going to run through that quickly, and then we'll talk about practically what you can do about some of these things. So let's start talking about some of the issues that I think some of us might be more familiar with. Common barriers for people who are low vision when using computers and accessing information online. People who have low vision, who have some sight but difficulty seeing, often rely on screen magnification software. And I think this is something that's become really easy for a lot of us to grasp now that we have things like smartphones and tablets, and you can use that two-finger zoom, where you can use two fingers to kind of zoom in on any part of your screen. I use this constantly when I'm trying to read really small print on a website on my phone. And I can take just the part that I want to see and blow it up to several times its normal size. And now I can't see the whole screen anymore, but I can see that part that I'm trying to read. This is really common software, even on a home computer, for a person who's low vision. So often, because we're blowing it up so large, it's not uncommon for only about 1/6 to 1/8 of the screen to be visible at any one time. So a really common barrier for someone who's using screen magnification software is having difficulty navigating around a document or a web page. We describe it as often swimming around the screen trying to find content. You can imagine if you could only see about 1/8 of the screen, you'd often be scrolling around trying to find what you're looking for. So some really common barriers in web design are having really long lines of text that require that someone using a magnifier would have to scroll all the way to the right to read the line, and then scroll all the way back to the left to start reading the next line. And it's so easy to lose your place in a block of text when that happens. Inconsistent placement of navigation items that you have on the screen. Suppose I need to know where to find how I can page forward and page back, as well as buttons on the screen. Maybe I need to click submit buttons or click a continue button. If they're not always in the same place in a document or on a web page, they can be really hard for someone to find who has to scroll around the screen to get to it. Screen magnification, and this is a known issue, often can miss content that's on the right side of the screen because of that scrolling issue. So we also recommend, just as a tip, the critical information, the key points that you want to make should actually be towards the left or the middle of the screen instead of the right. For users who are blind, who are accessing your website or your materials, they often rely on what we call screen reader software, which is, I think, about as simple as that sounds. It can actually read to you what's on the screen if you're not able to see it. One of the lesser understood things about screen reader software is it actually relies on the web designer to build the site in a way that the screen reader can access it or read the information. Screen readers are typically good at reading text, and they're good at reading the actual code that was used to create a website. But there are certain things that they cannot read, and images, any type of image, are a really common one. But there are ways to fix this that we're going to talk about today. So images that aren't labeled, this could be pictures, photographs, maps, text that wasn't directly entered, an image that includes text, or buttons can often be unreadable for a screen reader. Websites that require use of a mouse and don't allow for keyboard shortcuts, or websites that were actually designed using keyboard shortcuts that might interfere with the keyboard commands of the screen reading software, can make an online resource really difficult to use. Websites that are poorly designed or structured so that the contents of the page can't be quickly or easily located. As you can imagine, when I'm sighted, so when I look at perhaps a web page, I can very quickly use my eyes to scan around and find exactly what I'm looking for and read just that. For someone who uses a screen reader, the reading software is actually going to read through everything on the screen until I come to that one thing I'm looking for. So really being deliberate about design and thinking about how easy it is to get to the most important information quickly. And those are some of the kinds of things we can talk about today. Some common barriers for people with disabilities who are trying to access resources online that we don't necessarily talk or think about as often. People with an upper body mobility concern. This is a really broad range of disabilities. This could include anyone who just has some difficulty with fine motor control, maybe someone who hands shake, or someone who has osteoarthritis in their hands, that it might be more difficult for them to use a keyboard or a mouse, up to people who have no use of their arms or hands at all, perhaps someone who's quadriplegic, who has no to limited motion from the neck down. People who have upper body mobility concerns use all different types of adaptive equipment to make computers and technology more accessible. Someone might use a mouse stick to control their computer, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's literally a bite plate with a stick attached that you would use to actually tap keys or tap on a touch screen using a stick that you're holding with your teeth. voice recognition software and using voice commands. Some might use only keyboard commands and not use a mouse. There are adaptive mice out there, but keyboard commands and other technology are becoming so much more sophisticated. I'm under the impression that an adaptive mouse is less common, although TJ may know more about that than I, so he can disagree with me and tell you the truth once he starts talking if I've got that wrong. So some common barriers there. If it takes a lot of clicks to get to important information, that's much more complicated for someone who's using adaptive equipment who can't just easily scan a page and click it with their finger, or poor organization of site content. So thinking about how easy is it to get to the most important information, and how much longer would it take if I had to click 5, 6, 10 times just to get through to one piece of information I'm trying to access on a web page. Thinking about people who have cognitive or intellectual disabilities. This is just talking about some of your viewers who maybe take longer to process information. They might have difficulty processing some of the written language, images, numbers, things like that that are included in your documents or your websites. They may use types of screen readers that can even highlight text or use synthesized speech to help facilitate their comprehension of what's on the web page. They may use captioning for audio and video. We think of, I didn't necessarily talk as much about common barriers for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, but absolutely captioning for audio and video is critical there. It's also really helpful for a lot of people who have cognitive disabilities to be able to process what it is that they're seeing. So some common barriers there, use of unnecessarily complex language, and even the way that one line of text is written, unnecessarily complex language. Those are a lot of big words, and this is something we all do. We all do this. I've been through many, many media trainings in my lifetime. We all use really big words because we all want to sound very smart, and we want to sound like what we're saying is very important. But not even just people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, but the average American has more trouble processing these really complex sentences and these really big words that we're fond of using. So we can lose a lot of our readers that way. Lack of graphics. Graphics, if they're done accessibly, can actually be really helpful for helping someone understand the information. If you've got a lot of complicated text, using good images, good photos, good simple graphics can help break down that information. You want to have really clear and consistent organization of your information. That helps not just navigation, but it helps your viewer to really understand what it is that they're seeing on the page. We're going to talk a little bit about things like alternative text that can help make some of your graphics more accessible. So I won't talk about that too much yet, but keep that in mind. That is coming a little later in the presentation. Having visual and audio elements can be really helpful for helping your viewer understand the information that you're presenting, but being really conscious of how we're using it and how much we're using it. Is it becoming distracting? If that's a concern, is there a way that the user can turn it off if it's something that it's not helpful for them to see or hear? Or there is always actually the possibility that those types of items can trigger seizures in people with different types of disabilities. One last word on that, talking about common barriers that we experience online, and even just thinking beyond that label of disability. Many people who do not identify as having a disability specifically, or who would not call themselves a member of the disability community, are also affected by inaccessibility online. This would include older adults, people who have limited English proficiency, people who have limited literacy. They don't necessarily identify as being part of the disability community, but would all benefit from this increased accessibility. Older adults often experience, and I'm sure we can all think of parents, grandparents, who lost some of their mobility, who have more limited eyesight, who perhaps have minor cognitive issues. This is changing, but older adults still do tend to have less experience using the internet and navigating a website. So thinking about good design, thinking about navigation, thinking about accessibility features would benefit this group of people who are also avid voters. People with limited English proficiency or limited literacy often find complex words and sentence structures challenging, as do most Americans who read at a much lower grade level than we generally anticipate, and can also find those types of materials really intimidating. So some common barriers: language that's not clear or direct, interface elements, that aren't supported by symbols, icons, pictures that help to make that information clear, or just using an inconsistent layout for your site, or a lack of unique page titles that make it really difficult to navigate and quickly find the information that you're looking for. I want to talk quickly a little bit about how you can write for your audience and talk about disability in ways that are appropriate and respectful, especially if you are going to take Tony's advice and think about how to create a strong disability platform as part of a campaign. So we talk a lot about in the disability community about using words with dignity. How do we talk about disability in a way that's respectful of the person and of the voter? And some of these are not that common, unfortunately, in popular media and popular culture. So I wanted to give this to you quickly. Disability is an identity. For people with disabilities, it's another part of who you are, the same way your gender is a part of your identity. Your race or ethnicity is a part of your identity. Your religion, your sexual orientation are all part of your identity. So is your disability. And because of that, to us, disability is neutral. It's not a bad thing. What's a bad thing are barriers that are created by our environment and created by attitudes. Having a disability is not a bad thing. Having designed a society that's not accessible to everyone is. And so in the disability community, it's not a tragedy. It's not a health or medical issue that's to be solved by doctors. It's just part of who we are. And I debated a little bit, but I included on the slide here the word inspiration porn. This is a trending word in the disability community right now, based on the idea of how we talk about disability in popular media and in popular fiction and movies, the idea that disability is this horrible tragedy that some of us overcome, and that we're so inspired by people who overcome their disability. For a person who has a disability, it's not a tragedy, and we're not here to inspire you. It's just who we are. We want to talk practically about what kind of supports we can have for people with disabilities to live independently in the community. So ending the inspiration porn is a huge issue for people in our community. So thinking about those things as you're writing to try to reach out to voters. You are inevitably going to be reaching out to people who have disabilities. And so thinking about talking about disability in a way that's respectful and speaks to our community. Some really simple ways to break this down. I am so sorry I did not describe the picture on that last screen. There's a bunch of kids who are holding diplomas and they're wearing caps and gowns. There's 4 of them, and one kid in the middle is using a wheelchair and has a huge smile on his face. He's adorable. So moving forward, thinking about how you can use words with disability in a real practical way. We like to say a person with a disability, or you could say disabled. What you want to avoid are words like handicapped, which is really, really frowned upon in our community. Or some of those older words that you don't hear a lot anymore, words like cripple or invalid, that were more common once upon a time. It's always safe to put the person first. We call it people first language. So to say a person who has, that might be a person who has cerebral palsy, a person who is blind or low vision. Staying away from terms that portray disability as a tragedy, like someone who is afflicted with, or somebody who is a victim. When it comes to people who use wheelchairs, we like to say it just like that, a person who uses a wheelchair. We really avoid terminology like restricted to a wheelchair, confined to a wheelchair, or wheelchair bound. For a person who uses a wheelchair, that wheelchair is not something they're confined to. A wheelchair is something that is an extension of who you are, and it represents freedom. Wheelchairs are what help people get out of the house and out into the community, help get people to and from work. A wheelchair is an amazing tool that helps you to be independent. It's not something that you're bound to, and it's not something that's really seen as negative for a person who uses it day to day. When we talk about people who don't have disabilities, using terms like non-disabled or able-bodied are perfectly acceptable. We try to stay away from the saying normal, that somehow implies that a person who has a disability is not normal, when in reality varying levels of disability are a completely normal part of the human experience. A couple more quick notes on how to use words with dignity, and there's a photo up in the corner of a couple folks who are in some fairly professional dress having what looks like a very intense conversation. We prefer terms like deaf and hard of hearing when talking about that community. We avoid terms like deaf mute or deaf and dumb. When you're talking about mental illness, which has become somewhat of a hot topic in the legislative world right now, we prefer person-first language, so saying a person with a mental illness, a person with a psychiatric history, person with emotional disorder, a person who receives mental health services. Avoiding terms like insane, mental patient, psychotic, crazy, schizophrenic, all those really salacious words that we do see a lot in the media that are not particularly respectful of people who are living with mental illness. And lastly, in talking about intellectual and cognitive disabilities, people who have a cognitive disability, person with an intellectual disability, learning disability, developmental disability, the term mental retardation is no longer in common usage and can be considered very offensive. So staying away from mental retardation, MR, retardation is definitely recommended and is definitely a better way to really tap into a base of voters with disabilities who are eager to hear about disability platforms and eager to be spoken to by candidates. So just a quick word on using what we call plain language. Beyond just using respectful language to talk about disability, writing in a way that's easier for all to understand can do a lot for your campaign to make it more accessible, not just for people with disabilities, but for all voters. You want to communicate to your audience in a way that they can understand the first time they read or hear it. And plain language is a term that we use a lot in the disability community to talk about this, but I will say it's defined very much by the results. So plain language may look different in different settings. It is possible to break highly complex, technical, legal language down into plain language, but how that's done differs. It's really about the results. Can I find, understand, and use the materials to meet my needs quickly and easily? Some of the highlights of that are having a logical organization to your materials with the reader in mind, maybe breaking up large blocks of text into topics. Using headings and titles to separate blocks of text that you've broken up into topics, and titling sections in a way that is logical for your reader. If I were listening to a presentation and we're going to ask a question, how would I phrase that question, and could that be turned into a heading? If I were going to Google this to learn more about this topic, what search terms would I use, and how could I use that in a title? Using short sentences, especially being even online, there's an expectation we're going to be even more concise than we would be on paper. Every time you approach a topic or a key term or some jargon, writing the text in a way that explains it as if it's brand new every time, so that every section of text could be a standalone piece, that I could read just this and understand what I need to understand without assuming that your reader has gone through several other documents or several other sections of your web page in order to understand what's in front of them right in the here and now. Using a lot of active voice and common everyday words. And we often recommend focusing on probably not more than a 4th or 5th grade reading level to ensure that the largest number of voters are going to be able to understand what it is that they're looking at. If this is something that you want to learn more about, then I highly, highly recommend. My whole career has been about access to the vote. Voter education, get out the vote. And living in that world, we use so much jargon in the voting world. And then you get out there and you talk to real voters and you realize that they don't talk about this stuff all day, every day. And it's really important to break it down into plain language, so I really recommend it. Legislation actually has been passed by the federal government requiring plain language when federal funding is involved. So you can actually go to plainlanguage.gov, and they have some amazing stuff on that website. They break down what exactly plain language means. They give you examples of good plain language model websites, so many resources that make it so easy to break down your actual materials into plain language. And if this is something you're really interested in pursuing, which I strongly recommend, I cannot say enough about Catherine Summers, who is a professor at the University of Baltimore and really one of the leading people in the field of plain language. She is known specifically for taking highly technical and highly skilled language and breaking it down into plain language that anyone can pick up and understand. So it is quite possible, and I definitely recommend tapping into those resources. I can talk more about that during Q&A if people are interested in hearing more about that. And with that said, we were going to take one more quick Q&A break to see if there are any questions before we jump into the next portion, where DJ is going to talk a little bit about how to technically make sure that your online
And just as a note, all of our Q&A break slides have an image of a classroom with students raising their hands and the teacher at the front of the classroom in front of a chalkboard. Wow, that was a lot of information that Michelle went through. Who's got questions for her?
Hi, this is Ruthie Goldcorn.
Go ahead, Ruthie.
Thank you for the information. Hi, and the plainlanguage.gov is extremely helpful. I have been accused of making up words. My daughter loves to tell me that I make words up like cogitate, among others. And the argument that we get, and I don't know whether or not there's a better way to counter this argument, and that's why I'm raising this to you, is, well, that's just the way it's been, and those are the words, and why do we have to change that? Why do we have to think about not using the word handicapped and so on? And I simply say language evolves. We don't use the same language we did in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, even though groovy is coming back, it's nice. Guys and gals is not used anymore. Cats and kitties to refer to men and women. Language evolves, and that's why people with disabilities is more respectful and understanding that developmentally disabled replaces the R word, because that word was always insulting, but it took a while to gain favor. What other kinds of arguments, aside from the fact that language evolves? You know, we look at things differently, we become more sophisticated, the population evolves, everybody grows up. What other level of argument to people who don't understand why they can't use those words anymore or refer to people like that anymore, especially media people, because as candidates, we're always talking to them, and they tend to then mishmash everything. What other types of argument and words would get the point across so that it's not a burden on someone to try and think of people first? Thank you.
So I can try to touch on this quickly, Ted, if you don't mind. I do think language evolves is a really important point. And I would say I don't know of any pollster or any campaign that has not tried to capture the Black vote, particularly as the Black community grows in the United States. I would bet that people tend to use the phrase Black or African American and would not dare use the phrase Negro in their campaigning, despite the fact that that was actually the common term at one point. So for people with disabilities, it's not any different. The difference is just that we have not really been talking about the disability community as much, unfortunately. And that leads me into my next point, which is that when we started this presentation talking about the fact that there are tens of millions of people with disabilities in the United States. The U.S. Census indicates we're probably 1 in 5 of Americans, and that's just people with disabilities. When you start to add in their friends, their family members, their employees, their employers, anyone who knows and cares about someone with a disability, we're talking about an enormous voting bloc, and as Ted demonstrated, it's growing. So if you're unwilling to talk to 1 in 5 of Americans in a way that they find respectful, I would say good luck to you and how that campaign is going to turn out. To be completely honest, I mean, I can appeal to your sensibilities that it's just more respectful, and maybe that's a nice thing to do. But to be completely honest about it, if you want to win, you should probably make a commitment to talking to all Americans in a way that they find most respectful. Otherwise, I don't know how that's going to work out for you. So I hope that's helpful. Ted, if there's anything else that you would add to that, please.
No, I think that the most important thing that folks have to realize, and for campaigns to realize, goes back to some of the stuff that Tony Coelho shared with us earlier in this webinar, and that is that when it comes to language and nomenclature for a community, you have to ask that community. The word handicap was not developed by people with disabilities. It was developed by people without disabilities who institutionally or somewhere behind the scenes in their hearts and minds were still struggling to figure out how they felt about people with disabilities. And so disability, or people with disabilities, is the word that people with disabilities have chosen. And so, you know, with any type of language and nomenclature, oftentimes what becomes common first is that the names and the words and the descriptions that people who are not of that group but who have the perceived power start using, because they're struggling to figure out what are the right words, and yet to give up or to actually ask that community, how do we talk about you, how do we talk with you, how do we include you, would be to give up a little bit of their power. And so as communities gain their own power, they can define for themselves how they want to be talked about and how they want to be referred to. And so I think that's really the most important thing. And it goes even to things like, you know, cultural competency around accommodation. Don't make it, you know, you don't make an assumption about how someone needs to be accommodated. You ask them what their accommodation needs are. So just like asking them what you know, how they want to be referred to, ask the community how they want to be accommodated, etc. So it's, again, asking the community and letting the community speak for itself and not making any quick judgments and taking anyone for granted in your process. So having people with disabilities at the table through all aspects of your campaign and your campaign planning when it comes to developing your websites and developing your web tools and things like that, and not necessarily developing something and then showing them something. Have them there at the beginning. Have them have at least one advisor, if not a few advisors, who are from the disability community there at the very beginning as you're planning your documents, as you're planning your website, as you're planning your tools, so that they can tell you how, you know, from the community perspective, these things are going to be most helpful for you to communicate to them. And then I would just go back to remembering that you have 36 million eligible voters in the United States. In California alone, it's 5.9 million eligible voters that are operating at somewhere around, in any given year, if you add all the years together and average them, around 50%. If they get over 50%, that's a game changer in pretty much every election. So it becomes a huge, huge voting bloc that's able to tip the scale. So it's an important group of people. I see that Mark Ramoser has a question. We'll take one from Mark, and then we're going to move on to some more accessibility. Mark? So Mark's question is, for Michelle, we had an incident here where the accessible voting machine was covered with a flower arrangement. Poll workers disliked them because they take an extra half an hour to tally after the polls close.
Oh,
and just to be, today's subject is about campaign website accessibility and online tools accessibility. So this is really an election protection question, but I'm going to go ahead and let, so it's kind of off topic for today, but I'll go ahead and let Michelle answer the question, and then we'll move forward.
Yeah, I can be quick with this one. I'm very involved in election protection efforts, so this is right up my alley. The only thing I would say to that is that no matter how any of us feel about those machines, they're required by federal law in federal elections. The poll workers don't get to make those decisions. So if you request to use it, they have to let you use it. If they are uncomfortable using them, it's probably time to address how the poll workers are being trained or what resources are being provided on election day to help them use the equipment, because very often the poll workers are uncomfortable because they have not been adequately trained on that. Poll worker training is a very difficult issue. If you see something like that, I would recommend you can call the Election Protection Hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, OURVOTE. You can talk to the poll supervisor. You can talk to the election authority for that jurisdiction. to get those types of things resolved. I'll go ahead and put my email address in the chat window if anyone wants to talk a little bit more about those types of issues. I'm more than happy to help you. But they're required by federal law. So they can't cover them with flowers. They do have to allow people to use them. And with that, I'll go ahead and put some info in the chat window so we can, anyone who wants to chat with me about that offline, please do.
Great, thank you. And we're going to have more webinars and things like that down the line that will address things of that nature. So I'm going to move us along and hand things off to TJ. TJ, welcome. All right, and TJ is going to start talking to us about documents and those online tools and stuff like that. So go for it, TJ.
All right, thanks, Ted. Yeah, my name is TJ Schlowski, and I'm going to just kind of do a very high-level overview of about making documents accessible. And just to kind of preface that, making documents accessible is the primary responsibility of the people that are actually putting these documents together. Being able to do that with knowledge is very simple. It's not very hard to do. We do offer, there are a lot of actually online resources out there to do this, and we do have some of those resources listed on here. So, but we're just going to kind of go over it, and if anyone has any questions, please ask. So, to start off, first off, on this slide we have a little icon that looks like a piece of paper. Personally, I would look at it as a new document kind of icon that you would find in the toolbar where it has lines representing text. The first document that we're going to talk about are Word documents. Generally, Word documents are accessible as long as you follow the proper styles that are predefined in your word processor and that correspond with document structure. So if anyone can kind of visualize with me that when you're using a word processor, you kind of have a ability to pick your fonts, whether it be Verdana, Times New Roman, or then you have the ability to select an actual font size. Then you can bold it, underline it, italicize it, and kind of do all that kinds of things independently. What we try to promote is using predefined styles that are already set up in Word, specifically Word. Hopefully some of you have seen in the actual ribbon window where you have items called titles, or you have items called headings, italicized, bold. So what that does is when you select those, instead of going in and doing them kind of by hand, it lets the word processor know that you want these to look a certain way. And what that essentially does is kind of puts it in the back end. So individuals using assistive technology will be able to decipher that information. It also helps later on down the road if you were to take a Word document and switch it over to a PDF, or if you were going to create a PowerPoint presentation. So just kind of a good rule of thumb when creating an accessible Word document is using heading styles. If you have a heading on your page, or if you have a title, to mark it up that way using those proper styles. When you have a list, to actually use the list, whether it be a bulleted list or a numbered list. Not going into the Word document and hitting the number 1 period and then tabbing over 3 times. That is doing it the manual way, which unfortunately if we were to take a document and try to import it into and make it into a PDF, that would not carry over that you were trying to make a list. Also, adding alternative text to images or graphs or things that you have in your Word document. Michelle did broach on that a little bit. Alternative text is a super important idea. Usually when we talk about accessibility and we have these types of meetings like this, alternative text is, that's the only thing they ever talk about. Like, oh, just make sure you have alt text. Well, Alt text is important, but there are other things that are important as well. Alt text essentially adds meaning to images that individuals using assistive technology may not be able to see or infer themselves. So keeping that alternative text simplistic, actually word for word for things that are being displayed on the screen. If you have a chart, it would be a verbal description of what that chart would be. You want to try to keep it as concise and consistent as possible. Also, alt text only needs to be put in place for items that convey important information. So if you have decorative images, alt text would not necessarily be required for decorative images. Now also, we also use tables in our Word documents. Trying to use simple table structure is very important when you're actually using tables in your Word document. Paying very close attention not to merge cells or split cells. Trying to keep it very marked up to where you can actually have actual table row headers. So an individual could go in and be able to navigate that table, whether it be using a screen reader or some type of technology. And then also putting an actual caption or just a general overview of what this table is supposed to represent. Another thing that I forgot to put in here for Word documents is specifically not using color to represent data. If you are going to use a color, make sure that that color also has some type of something added to it that helps say that red resembles things that were not filled out properly. Yellow is just an identifier. So next, a little bit more in specific. When I was filling this out, I actually had removed this slide, and Ted said that it's very heavily, these actually things are used very heavily in the campaign community. So tables and graphs, definitely something, because when you're trying to convey information, you want to try to make it as simple as possible. Graphs and charts, they should be, try to be avoided as much as possible, but if they do have to be used, then you do need to provide alternative text. You need to actually provide a verbal description of what would be being displayed. So if you were to explain it to an individual that has a vision impairment, you would need to actually be able to, word for word, be able to describe it. And again, like I said, tables are the most accessible information when they're presented in a logical order, and they are not complex. It's very frustrating for individuals that use screen readers or assistive technology to try to navigate tables when they are not marked up properly with table headers. Also, italics, bullets, and justifications. Use less justification as much as you possibly can. Any type of adding italics or anything like that, as long as it is representing, you're not representing information by saying this italicized text for a footnote or something like that. Bullets and numbering and indentations are difficult for screen readers and to get if they are not marked up as lists. And it's also, if you have individuals that are using Braille, it's sometimes difficult for them to be able to find place markers to where they can actually see where they're going and being able to read. Something that's also super important, scan documents. In this day and age when we have a Xerox machine or we have all-in-one systems that allow us to take a page and scan them in and literally make them into a PDF. Those are not accessible. Those are merely images that have been made into a file that we can very easily email to one another. Scanned images, we always have to need to remember that whether it's a picture or a document, whether it has words or graphs or anything like that, 9 times out of 10 are going to be an image unless an individual has taken special steps to make sure that it is accessible. I apologize, I forgot. We do have an image on this page. where it's a page navigation tool showing specifically page navigations for Adobe Reader. So next slide. So we talked about Word, now we're going to talk about Adobe PDF. For individuals that are in the community that try to make accessible documents, PDF is supposed to stand for Portable Document Format. In the accessibility world, PDF stands as pretty darn frustrating. Everyone uses the PDF format because it allows you to retain the look and feel of your document across different platforms. But unfortunately, if you are not taking the right steps, PDFs usually are not accessible. Important things for individuals that are making PDFs to check accessibility. Adobe Acrobat actually has an accessibility checker built in. This will allow an individual that has made a PDF to actually go and check and see if there are major concerns, so if the PDF is not accessible. Also, again, you need to make sure that if your PDF is not a scanned image, because if your PDF is an image, no matter what steps you take, it will not be accessible unless you actually go in and take special steps to provide optical character recognition, or OCR, of that document, and then go through and try to tag it. There are actually, one of the references that I will be giving out is WebAIM, and WebAIM has a significant amount of articles that will actually walk individuals through to how to make an accessible Word document, how to make an accessible PDF. So if anything, this information, take that type of resources with you so that you can go back and refer back to those articles that provide step-by-step and helpful information. We'll go to the next slide. All right. Pictures and non-text media. Naturally, pictures and videos are not accessible, hence the talk about having to provide alt text, having to provide closed captioning, and also having to provide video description. For pictures, we'll just repeat, providing alt text, which also stands for alternative text markup. So basically, any image that you have that conveys information, like for instance when Ted was talking about the DO Network logo, that would be an alt text for that, because it's an image that we want to emphasize because it has important information. When it comes to video, for those that are in the world of accessibility, and when it comes to making documents accessible, closed captioning, making sure, like with this webinar where we have the closed captioning capability, so word for word, so individuals that are deaf or hard of hearing can follow along with me. Also, providing video description. Video description is rather new. I'm not sure if a lot of you are familiar, but Netflix is very big on video description, where they promise, if I'm not mistaken, all of their videos have an actual auditory description. So video description or auditory description is a little bit different than closed captioning. That is an actual next step that is used for people that are visually impaired, that if you're watching a movie and it's a dark skyscraper with lights down the center, it actually will give you a auditory description of what is being displayed on the screen. Next slide, please. So here's a little crash course in alternative text. We have an image here of the Microsoft Office Word desktop. And in this Microsoft Word desktop, we have an icon with a button that is red, white, and blue with the text that says, "Every vote counts." So what we're actually doing on this screen is adding alternative text. So in Microsoft Word, what you would end up doing is you would right-click on the image that you want to add alt text to. You would left-click on Format Picture, And then there is an icon in the pop-up box that comes up where it's a little blue square that has measurement symbols to the left and to the right, and opens up a alt text box or alt text submenu. And in this title, in this pop-up, we have a title and a description. So since we're trying to say that this is a button that has the text that every vote counts on it, we have the title of a vote button with a description, red, white, and blue button that reads, every vote counts. So that's kind of, just a real quick idea of what a proper alternative text or alt text would be. Go ahead into the next slide. All right, so accessible website design. On this page, we have an individual with glasses holding a card, and sarcastically, I look at it as a sarcastic smirk saying, "Is your website accessible?" Question. Website accessibility is a very huge topic when it comes to accessible websites, accessible documentation. The web is constantly changing. It is constantly evolving. We are here in Illinois. We constantly get people trying to get in contact with us, asking us if our website is accessible. The key thing that I can always say is, and when you are building a website, please make sure accessibility is right there in the front, saying, asking the questions. When you are trying to build a website, try to go and find your local web accessibility standards for whether it's in your state, whether if you're a state entity following the state standards, or if you are a national entity trying to follow the national standards. Just a little brief information, the national standard would be the WCAG 2.0, and WCAG stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This was created by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. That is the national organization that tries to help entities, technical entities, to be able to provide them with standards for when they are building a website and what the national standard would be for an accessible website. Hopefully, without getting too far and not getting on my soapbox, the 508 standards are when they get their act together and actually pass the new standards for web accessibility. The rumor has it is that they will be using WCAG 2.0 as the standardization. So if we can get that all taken care of, we will hopefully then have a federal standard that everyone has to use. So back on topic. Navigation. Consciously display the most important information first. Make sure that your information that you want to have important to the individuals that you want viewing your website, make sure that they have headings for navigation. Think about how many clicks, like Michelle was saying, when an individual that doesn't have a disability actually has to use a website, they literally will just visually see it and move the mouse. Well, what about an individual that doesn't have the ability to use a mouse, has to use a keyboard? Think of all those, what I refer to as tab stops, or how many times it takes to tab to get to a link that you're going to want to be able to click on. Direct link text rather than saying click here. That is a huge problem where if you just say click here, an individual that's using a screen reader doesn't know what that means. Like, be very descriptive in your link text. Another very nice thing is this accessibility panel. I don't know how many of you have actually gone to the Dune Network website, but there is a little toolbar that allows you to integrate, the toolbar that's integrated into the website that allows you to decrease or increase text size, or allows you to change color contrast. Things that are built in to your computer, but sometimes, a lot of the times, people don't know how to access them. The accessibility panel is a good example. Also, there are other companies that make tools like that do the same thing. It's just the ability to get the accessibility out in front of your face to where you will be able to use it and see how to use it. And then also assess compatibility with magnifiers and screen readers. When you're using screen readers and you're using websites, navigation is a really big pain. A lot of the mainstream magnifiers now have kind of gone the way of what screen readers have been doing and allowing individuals to navigate websites with document structure, with headings, with links, with edit fields. So when you make your website, you're going to have individuals that use assistive technology that have this preconceived notion that I'm going to be able to go to important things on your website by navigating headings. I'm going to be able to do keyboard combinations to go to the first link or get a links list. So it's very important that when you are wanting to include everyone, especially on the design of your website, you need to take a look at these accessibility standards, where not only is it an accessibility issue, but it's also a usability issue. Usability is super important because you're not merely just dealing with an individual with a vision impairment. You're also dealing with, like what Michelle was talking about, individuals that have problems with cognitively understanding how a website flows. Individuals that may have to be using speech recognition. Individuals that may be needing to use keyboards. There are a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration. Next slide, please. Here are some of the resources that I was talking about. WebAIM is a very nice website. It kind of goes over a very broad brushstroke about accessibility and the different steps that it can be done to make to make documents accessible, Word documents, PowerPoint documents, PDFs. The next is the W3C website. This is where you can get the most latest up-to-date information about the WCAG 2.0 guidelines. Also, another plug for the Association of Assistive Technology Acts programs, ATAP. Basically, if you were needing assistance within your local state, you could go to this website and see what the Assistive Technology Act program was and then be able to ask them questions. Any state program should be able to help out, but if not, you will also have my contact information at the end. I am always willing to help out as much as I possibly can because when it comes to accessibility and digital documents and websites and applications and all that kind of stuff, it is very daunting. And the more help that you can get, the better off you will be. I think that was all my slides.
All right, okay. We're back to that question and answer slide with the classroom raising their hands and the teacher up front by the chalkboard. So who's got questions for TJ? Because that was a lot of great information, and really I think that was the kind of hands-on technical information that's going to be most useful for political campaigns, whether they're a nonprofit in the disability world doing nonpartisan get out the vote or a candidate running for office. The first question, I'll just start us off. So in thinking about everything you shared with us, TJ, one of the interesting things is, should campaigns, take the word of the software salesperson or what's written on the box that the product that they're buying and they're putting out there is accessible, or what should they do to be testing their products?
In a perfect world, I would love to believe every salesperson that comes into me and says, "Hey, my website is accessible or my application is accessible." Unfortunately, there are that is very commonly not the case. you know, getting technical, hopefully not too technical, there are things called VPATs. Now, VPATs are, and of course, I am a very bad individual when it comes to terminology, but voluntary product accessibility templates. So if a company that you're doing business with, hopefully, will come out and you can ask them, is it accessible? Or you need to ask for them if they have any voluntary product accessibility template documentation. It goes in and usually, say for instance, the state of Illinois has a VPAT that we use that asks questions about the application or about the website, saying, you know, do you follow Section 508 guidelines? Do you have alternative text on your images? Do you have proper labels on your excuse me, on your edit fields? Have you ever tested it with a screen reader, screen magnifier, or have you ever tested it with keyboarding or voice recognition? These are very important questions that you need to ask these companies, because essentially you're giving them money to be able to do things for you, and they need to have your best interests or your best interest at hand. And when it comes to accessibility, you need to push that, because usually the canned answer is yes. And then you need to go, could you please prove it? And the way that you can prove it is by asking, having a VPAT to have these questions predefined that they need to answer.
So, and you know what I think is really interesting is, you know, we at the DO Network, or just, I don't know if it's maybe just me personally, Ted Jackson, I tend to take a more rudimentary grassroots route to testing, and that is that we are asked to test websites all the time, and especially ever since it was really kind of our members who discovered that the California online voter registration was not fully accessible, because it had tested accessible on a brand new computer at the state of California. And what we do is we just get a variety of different people to test it and give us feedback. So we've got like a short list. So I've got a list of, you know, of people who have a computer that was, you know, bought 6 months ago, one that's 3 years old, one that's 10 years old, one that's 5 years old, different operating systems. And so I would recommend to campaigns that you really have that kind of short list of folks that can, in a pinch, run through your pages and test them out, because the thing about people with disabilities, about the disability community, is that we do have high rates of unemployment in California. So people are often using a computer that is at a library or an independent living center, or is not the newest model if they have one at home. And so, you know, you want to make sure that what you have on your website is accessible for those folks as well. And those may be, by and large, some of the largest numbers of those voters with disabilities that are out there. And it would be a shame if you had a great message for voters with disabilities, but they just kind of turned you off and went to another candidate because they couldn't get through your website. And believe me, that happens more times than not. So it's a real eye-opener to just have those regular, everyday folks. Maybe they could even be volunteers from your campaign who might be using assistive technology, that you could call up and say, hey, can you test this out on your computer right now? Are there any other questions? Any other questions for TJ? Well, I just want to thank both TJ and Michelle and Tony for joining us today. It was really, really awesome. Just a few quick words before you all leave. Here's on the slide here is our contact information. This, of course, is also in the document that was sent out with your confirmation, the outline for today's webinar. It's at the end of that email. You can click on the link and download that outline. This information is on there. And then also, just wanted to touch on what's next. A couple things I'm very excited about. So we are going to be doing 2 more of these Making Your Campaign Accessible webinars. The next one we should be announcing soon will be offices, events, and voter contact. So then we're going to be really talking about, today we talked about electronic access. On that one, we're going to be talking about physical access. Like, how do you make your office physically accessible for people who have mobility issues, to make sure there's navigation room for wheelchairs, etc. Same thing at your campaign rallies and big events, and in doing voter contact, connecting with voters via phone banks, and how maybe those can turn into text banks, and how you can do that with a one-on-one, door-to-door situation as well, and be accessible there, and be inclusive of people with disabilities. The other one under the Making Your Campaign Accessible banner is not on the slide here because it just got confirmed last night, but we will be doing a social media one. I'm very excited about that because we have a lot of young, great social media folks that are actually going to be training us on that one, and there are some pretty big accessibility considerations when you're using things like Facebook and Twitter to communicate your campaign message. In fact, just in the last few days, Twitter added the alt text for pictures that TJ was talking about as a function to Twitter. So keep an eye out for that one as well. And then keep an eye out later this month or in May for a webinar on building disability electoral power. So we talked a little bit about what that means at the beginning of today's webinar, but we're really going to expand that into a full-hour webinar about how people with disabilities are beginning to build electoral power and what that means across the United States. So dates and times are coming soon, and please keep a lookout. And then last thing before you leave today, please take the survey. We really appreciate it if you'd share your experience with us by completing the survey. Your feedback is highly valued and participation is greatly appreciated for our future webinar opportunities. When you exit the webinar platform, a pop-up training survey window will appear. And thank you very much, folks. Have a great day. And don't forget to vote disability.